to another presentation by Resilient Hurunui. Thanks very much for coming out on a windy but changeable night. I think it might be a bit different when we step out later. We're fortunate tonight to have Dr. Kirk, who is going to talk to us about, how can I put it, reconciling government regulations with practice in terms of water management. And so I'll hand over to Nick. I think what we will do as we've done in previous meetings is have questions after Nick has made his presentation and see how things go from there. So over to you, Nick. Thank you.
Ko waio, no kotirana, no ingarangi o kutupuna, ko Geraldine Paget te kaipuki, I tipu ake ao e o tatahi, I tangata Tiriti ao, he pakiha ao, ko Nicholas Kirk toko ingoa no reira, tēnā koutou katoa. Hello everyone, thank you for the introduction. My name is Dr. Nicholas Kirk and I'm here to talk to you today about a presentation called Turning Words into Actions, how community catchment groups achieve environmental outcomes. First thing I want to point out is that there's more than just my name up there. There's the names of two of my colleagues, Melissa Robson-Williams and Andrew Fenimore, who I've been working with closely for the last 2 years, as well as Nathan Heath, who works for the Hawke's Bay Regional Council. And the presentation I'm going to give to you today is sort of the culmination of a couple of years' work that I've been doing with these individuals, looking first at freshwater policy implementation, and then sort of more broadly about how to, I guess, achieve outcomes that we're all seeking out of freshwater management in New Zealand. I don't have much time to waste, so I'll get right into it. So first, I just want to do a wee bit of scene setting. I'm sure most of the people here know about New Zealand's freshwater politics, but I do still think it's probably good to bring in a wee bit of context to start here. So what you see up here is a recent report which was released by Lincoln University. They do a biannual Perceptions of the Environment report. And what this report here shows is that when compared with other natural resources, the freshwater resources like wetlands and rivers and lakes are considered by the public to be in a worse quality when compared with other sort of natural resources. Now when thinking about rural areas, this perception does seem to be backed up by the latest science. This is a report released by the Ministry for the Environment and Statistics New Zealand again last year in 2019, which was basically an environmental snapshot of New Zealand in regards to water resources in rural areas. This is what they said. Waterways and farming areas are polluted by excess nutrients, pathogens and sediment. This threatens our freshwater ecosystems and cultural values and may make our water unsafe for drinking and recreation. So in response to both the public perception that freshwater is declining and the science which sort of confirms it in some cases that freshwater quality is declining, over the last decade both the previous national government and the current Labour government have been issuing a lot of different national policy directions around freshwater. Now I wish I could go into all of these in quite a lot of detail, but I think I should probably skip over them. But what we have here is 3 different versions of the national policy statement for freshwater management. So just to explain in brief, the Ministry for the Environment are responsible for developing national policy, which then has to be accounted for by regional councils and their policies and plans. The National Policy Statement for Freshwater Management, the first version of which was released in 2011, was the first time that MFE had set requirements that cut across all the different regional councils and unitary authorities in New Zealand. What that 2011 version introduced was the idea that councils had to set water quality and quantity limits for each of the catchments. The 2014 version, which you can see up there, introduced something called the National Objectives Framework, which sort of sets out a process for identifying values in freshwater bodies, the attributes which help achieve those values, and then sort of a ranking system of where those attributes sit in regard to different freshwater bodies. The 2017 version sort of expanded upon this and sort of began to introduce this concept called Te Mana Aotearoa, which is basically a concept which in the very latest version of the National Policy Statement for Freshwater Management, which was released this year and just became operative a couple of days ago, now becomes the guiding concept behind freshwater management in New Zealand. And basically the idea is that it's the prime concept, the prime value underlying freshwater management in New Zealand is to protect the quality of fresh water. The National Policy Statement for Freshwater Management, like I said, has been updated again in 2020, but there's been a whole raft of other different policy initiatives which came through this policy document here, the Essential Freshwater Package. I don't want to go into the details too much here because there's just so much to say, but there's a lot of different new policies which have been coming out, which have been having different effects in different parts of the country. You might have heard about the dairy and winter issues, which are happening in Southwood at the moment, and a lot of this is a direct reflection of the policies laid out in the Essential Freshwater Package. There's also something called the National Environmental Standards for Freshwater Regulation, which is similar to the NPSFM, requires regional councils to update their plans and policies to reflect the changes which MFA has set at this national level. Now, I also want to broach the fact that all of this is happening within the context of the Resource Management Act. But very recently, this report has been released. It was a report by the Resource Management Review Panel, which was basically a set of lawyers who have experience, I guess, with the Resource Management Act, and they proposed repealing the Resource Management Act and replacing it with multiple different bits of legislation. So I guess what I want to say is that it appears like there's an appetite not only for developing freshwater policy, but for potentially re-envisioning the Resource Management Act, which is the whole thing which underpins that management. So the next part of my presentation, I just want to sort of bring in a wee bit of conceptual stuff, so do forgive me, but this is all an important part of the research, and this will hopefully make sense to you when I bring in the significance of the different case studies that we're talking about. But the first concept I want to bring up is this one here called the policy cycle. So the policy cycle is simply a heuristic for people to try and understand how the policy process works. So it's a lot more complex than this in practice, but it's a simplification of it to sort of highlight the different elements of the policy process. So I'll go through each part here bit by bit. So agenda setting is the very start. That's basically just the recognition that there might be a problem. So for example, with freshwater management, in the 1990s and the 1980s, the issues of freshwater quality and quantity in Canterbury weren't particularly important. It was seen as like an abundant resource. It wasn't on the agenda of the regional councils to really think about water management at the time. By the early 2000s, you see events like the Rangitata River Water Conservation Order, which was an order to protect the Rangitata River, as well as issues with groundwater abstraction in Selwyn, around where I live, in Ashburton. And I don't know as much about as I'm sure many people do here, but also you could probably consider the Hurunui Water Project and the plans to dam the main stem of the Hurunui River sort of brought these freshwater issues onto the agenda. So once they were onto the agenda, it was something that people were discussing, and they realised, oh, we need to formulate some sort of policy response to this, which is that second part of the cycle there on the right, policy formulation. So we know there's a problem, we know there are people that maybe have different values, what is it that we're going to do about this? So this is often the stage where policy people and planners get together and sort of try and formulate, okay, this is how we should respond. The next stage is decision making, so that's effectively where this policy becomes a political process, where it's someone like a politician, people in regional councils, people in central government who say, okay, we're going to agree, this is what the policy is. This next stage, policy implementation, is really what I want to focus on today. This is the stage where you turn those words, those agreements that are set in policy, into action. This is the things that you do on farm to achieve better freshwater quality. These are the things that you do in regards to, some wild and scenic areas in order to make them more amenable to recreation or something like that. This is where the actions on the ground actually take place. And then the final part of the policy cycle, if you ever get a chance to do it, is to have a wee bit of evaluation, what worked, what didn't. Let's go back and have a think about maybe if we can improve this again. But I guess maybe the main theme of my presentation here today is that I feel that this implementation phase is under-recognised and underappreciated by a whole range of different people, including councils, including central government, and ultimately that means that when we're trying to achieve freshwater outcomes, such as healthy streams and waterways that we can swim in, too much emphasis is going on to these earlier parts of the policy cycle, and not enough of it is going into actually putting actions on the ground to improve those freshwater bodies. So again, I just want to sort of highlight some sort of common policy implementation problems. Up until the 1970s, political scientists just thought, well, if you have policy, it gets implemented, and then everything works out fine. But sort of some researchers in the early 1970s had begun to see that there were quite a lot of issues with this sort of simplification. The first of these top-down issues. So this was sort of identified by American researchers. So you can imagine in the American political system, if you develop policy at the federal level, and then it goes through the state level, then it goes through another jurisdiction, then sort of goes down into its implementation, on land or, into actions that are taken out by the local jurisdictions there. That what was envisioned by the federal government by the time it gets down to the bottom could be completely different, especially because there's going to be a whole bunch of veto points along this chain which can be exploited by different actors to try and bring their own interpretation of the policy to bear. That also happens from the bottom up. So I don't really like this term, but they use this term called street level bureaucrats, which is effectively like the people that you might be interacting with from the district council or the regional council, who are there as representatives of them to try and enact these policies. And the bottom-up issues that they have is that you've got a community that these people are working in and dealing with, and this community says, look, what you're suggesting here isn't going to work, or we want to do something else, or we like a little bit of that policy, but we actually want to do this, this, and this as well. And they're caught, these street-level bureaucrats are caught between those demands of the community that they're working for and that they're living within, as well as the demands of either perhaps the council or the authority which is paying for them and which is the ones that are setting the policy in the first place. Also, there hasn't been any unified theory of policy implementation, probably because policy is developed and implemented in all sorts of different variety of jurisdictions around the world. There's all sorts of different contexts, whether those be the social context, the cultural context, the economic or biophysical context, which is totally different for different parts of the world. And so we can't really take lessons learned from America, from Europe, from Australia, and develop a unified theory and say, well, this is always going to work every single time. It's too complex, it's too context specific when you're developing and implementing policy just to say that this is going to be able to happen uniformly. But these papers here, which I just wanted to bring up on screen, are sort of papers that I initially read and which sparked these ideas about freshwater policy implementation in my head. So I read these papers and I could see that internationally, this one on the left here is from Brazil and these other two are from the United Kingdom. They were having real difficulties taking the effort they had put into developing really good and balanced policy into actual actions on the ground to help enact and implement those policies. So I thought to myself, I wonder if we're having these same issues in New Zealand. And this is part of the problem with freshwater politics in New Zealand. And so I set out with my colleagues that I mentioned earlier on. I'm skipping ahead a little bit. I was working with my colleagues looking at freshwater policy implementation challenges in New Zealand. But before I get to that, I just want to bring up another sort of conceptual issue, which again I think is going to be very important when I get to the case studies. And this is this idea of freshwater intermediaries. And I'm sorry, this is probably going to seem a wee bit abstract to you at this stage, but once we get to the case studies, I'm sure you'll be able to understand who these actors are and why they're important. So intermediaries is a type of person. They don't work necessarily for the government, and they don't necessarily have to be a member of the community, but they're people that sort of work in between. In this definition here, they say they connect, translate, and facilitate flows of information. What's important is that these actors help people like farmers, like councils, to actually implement these freshwater policies by being experts and being able to understand complex information and being able to translate them to the people that they're working with so that we can actually do actions on the ground. So like I said, intermediaries, they facilitate practice change and policy implementation because they possess this unique flexibility to work both with government but not for government, working with the community but not necessarily beholden to the community. Like I say, given the complexity of the policy process, given that there's multiple actors, there's multiple levels of government, and all these people have different perceptions of the issues, intermediaries are people who have the skills that are necessary to broker enduring solutions, like the ones that we'll see in a couple of examples of the catchment management groups I'll bring later on. Most intermediaries are currently in the private sector. Now, I've got a few examples here of actors that I think are intermediaries that you might understand or deal with in your day-to-day sort of stuff. So here in Canterbury, everyone has to complete farm environment plans. So there's a whole group of consultants and advisors who have the knowledge and expertise to help farmers fill out farm environment plans. Now, farm environment plans are considered like an important part of policy and policy implementation. So these are private actors who are helping farmers implement and comply with policy. Another example might be a representative from a fertiliser company who says, well, if you put on some fertiliser in this way, if you change the way that you do it, if you change the amounts, the timing, or whatever it happens to be, perhaps through using the overseer model to present different options, they are also private actors who are helping people to implement that policy on the ground. So this is, again, an example of an intermediary. But the one thing that I want to point out, and is basically the big issue with the intermediaries in the literature, is that these people are not necessarily like politically neutral. Like I say, they're in between the state and the community. So when they see that there's this new policy that needs to be implemented, there's things that need to be complied with in regards to freshwater management, for example, they could interpret what actions need to happen themselves, and that might not necessarily be politically neutral. It might not necessarily be what the community want broadly. They might have their own private interests that they're trying to meet in delivering these services. So a lot of people don't like freshwater intermediaries in the literature because they're concerned that they might capture this policy process and implement policy in their own way. But what I'm going to argue is that it's the work that they do which is currently undervalued and that is critical towards implementing freshwater policy and achieving outcomes. So I'm sorry I did sort of skip through to this earlier on in the previous slide, but what I now want to report on is just a little bit of research that I did with regional councils and unitary authorities last year, in which I asked them, well, we've got all of this new freshwater policy central government has developed. Can you please tell me what the barriers are to you actually turning this into action on the ground? What are your barriers that you're facing in regards to implementation? And the following is what they told me. So the first is that regional councils and unitary authorities are struggling to align national policy with the policy that they develop. So each regional council is required to write a regional plan and a regional policy statement. And every time that national policy statement for freshwater management I was talking about earlier is updated, they have to update their plans and policies to reflect that. Now, since 2011, that's been updated in 2014, 2017, and 2020. So every time that happens, the council has to go, oh, how are we going to figure out how to align what we've done with what MFE are telling us now? But it's not just the one, it's not just the NPSFM. You saw I mentioned the National Environmental Standard for Freshwater earlier. And then beyond freshwater management, there's a whole raft of different ones that are being introduced, like plantation forestry for biodiversity, for highly productive soils. And it's very difficult for regional councils to be able to constantly rethink and align their policy with what's being developed in Wellington, even if they have really close relationships with all these people that are doing this. In some parts of New Zealand, they just really struggle to have the rating base to staff the people that are necessary in order to be able to do this. So you see here this quote from a unitary authority: we're a small council, we have one water quality scientist and one water quantity scientist, and that's it. Now with the new 2020 NPSFM, these scientists are required to basically go out and measure and manage every single water body in every single catchment in that region. Without giving away where this unitary authority is, there's a couple of unitary authorities and regional councils, like say the West Coast Regional Council here, or the Gisborne District Council in the North Island, which have incredibly small rating bases, but have huge areas in which they're asked to manage. And unfortunately, they just do not have the resources at the moment to be able to do as good a job as they would want. Also, sort of interestingly enough, and I wasn't expecting this theme to come out of the interviews, but in some regions in New Zealand, they sort of lack the expertise to be able to do this as well. So here in Canterbury, we have research institutes like Manaaki, Whenua, and Niwa, and all of them are around. We've got 2 universities. But you know, if you're in Southland, if you're in Northland, even if you're in the Hawke's Bay, where I'm going to talk about later, there's not much of this expertise around. And so these councils have to develop it all in-house. That might not seem so challenging, but there is actually, you know, not so many people that have all the skills and knowledge to be able to do these things across the country. So lacking that community expertise is a real barrier to implementing freshwater policy. Another interesting thing is that the local context that these councils were describing to me is often very different from the national context. So the freshwater policy that was developed by central government in the last decade was, I think it's fair to say, highly influenced by the issues around intensive farming, diffuse pollution, and dairying. But that isn't necessarily the leading freshwater quality issue in other parts of New Zealand. In Northland, they have huge issues with sedimentation from the logging that has gone on over hundreds of years. They also have those huge issues with sedimentation in the Gisborne district in the Hawke's Bay, where I'm going to be talking about. In areas like the Whenua, they have market gardens, which are an issue there. And so for lots of councils, and as you can see here from this quote, this sort of one-size-fits-all approach that's being done by central government, which says every freshwater body must meet this particular quality standard that we're setting out, just isn't particularly working for them. And as they say here, this one-size-fits-all approach has created problems and extra costs for council and the community with no added benefit. And the last issue, which I probably will just skip over here, is that some unitary authorities perceive it to be more difficult for them to implement freshwater management. So I just want to sort of go through a few sort of key themes from this before I move on to the case studies. So one thing I want to say is that there seems to at the moment be poor cohesion between national policies, which creates implementation challenges for local governments. So as I said before, the national policy statement for freshwater management updated frequently, but how that policy interacts with the plantation forestry policy, how that interacts with the urban development policy, how that interacts with the highly productive soils policy, just has not been well thought out. And these interactions are unfortunately going to be the difficulties with them are going to be felt by farmers primarily when they try and implement and comply with these different policies on the ground. In my opinion, the Resource Management Act planning process that I've just been describing is not agile enough for local governments to respond to new problems and these new policy directions simultaneously. So I've described all these different new policies that they're having to implement and the issues there. But then if you get new problems like, I don't know, COVID-19 or a big storm or more chronic long-term problems like diffuse freshwater pollution, it's just really hard for them to be able to respond to these two simultaneously. So when new problems arise or new policies issued, often the emphasis goes on responding through resourcing the planning departments even more. What we argue is that this diminishes the resources available for non-regulatory policy implementation, as well as other tasks like monitoring, compliance and evaluation. So when ECAN sees that there's a new national policy statement for freshwater management, I've heard there's some ECAN people here today, so I'm not criticising, but when that comes out, often there's an emphasis from them because they know they need to update their plans by 2024. It's like, well, we need to hire more planners to get this done. Well, that's taking away money, time, resources that they could be using towards actually doing stuff on the ground, which brings environmental benefits and helps people comply with those policies. So, we've developed a solution. Remember that policy cycle that I was talking about went around like that? Well, we're talking about inverting it. What we need to do is to focus on achieving land use practice change prior to or simultaneous to policy development. Now, I might not have made this argument in the 1990s when MFE hadn't developed any policy, when there wasn't an actual any NRRP and ECAN or anything like that. But now we do have all of this policy. This policy is very prescriptive and it's going to be incredibly difficult to comply with it. So I think that rather than focusing on developing even more policy, what we should be doing is focusing on getting communities to encourage voluntary land use practice change through catchment community groups, while the councils and central government can continue this process of developing policy so they can work out all of these interactions and areas where they don't fit very well in a sort of slow and methodical manner, as opposed to the way in which it's happening now, which is basically to put it out as quickly as possible. So yeah, as I've just sort of described, our rationale is that that if we do invert this policy cycle, it will give governments more time to develop robust and realistically implementable policy, but it also permits communities to go out and actually start doing the actions which are going to improve freshwater quality. So, perhaps this is why we're all here, but I'm going to now talk about a wee bit of case study examples of these catchment community groups getting voluntary land use practice change in these catchments, and then in at least 2 examples you can see that there have been measurable improvements in different freshwater quality indicators. So all of them are from the Hawke's Bay region. The first one I'm going to talk about up here is the Whenua River in the Mahia Peninsula. Then I'm going to talk about the Taharua River, which is up near the border with the Taupo district, and then down to the south, the Paparui Stream, which is part of the wider catchment. So the first case study here is the Whenua Catchment Management Group. I must admit this is going to be the most impressive of the case studies. They have been winning national and international awards for the work that they've been doing. And what the Whenua Catchment Management Group is a group that was started by the community, which has a very influential and well-resourced intermediary who's able to help link the community and councils together, and as well as helping get different funding sources together so that the community can actually begin to improve freshwater quality. So the trigger for the development of the catchment management group was the creation of the Mahia Beach wastewater treatment plant. So what was happening in Mahia Beach was that everyone owned private septic tanks. The Wairoa District Council was worried that those privately owned septic tanks were starting to leak into the ocean. So what they proposed was the building of a wastewater treatment plant, which would take the wastewater from Mahia Beach and then deliver it, if I go back to the previous slide, right up in the headwaters of the Whenua. So at the top of the catchment there, you can sort of see something that says wastewater treatment plant. The Catchment Management Group formed in 2011 as a community response in opposition to the construction of the wastewater treatment plant. Tangata Whenua, in particular, in the Mahia Peninsula, were uncomfortable with the idea of wastewater being spread across the catchment and possibly contributing even further to the freshwater quality problems in the river. What happened was that a memorandum of understanding was signed in 2011 between the local councils, Tangata Whenua and landowners, and then after that they held a hui in which they established this sort of broad objective for all the actions which would come afterwards. And so that was to maintain or improve the different cultural, ecological, recreational and and economical values of the Whangariki catchment identified by the community ensure, maintain or improve a healthy awa. So the catchment administrator, the person that I consider a freshwater intermediary, was hired in November 2012 to deliver a catchment plan. Meetings were held in a local marae, but it wasn't like a closed meeting. Anyone was welcome to come along. I mean, kids were welcome to come along, families were welcome, and the marae was chosen specifically, and a lot of activities were taken in the school to try and engage families to be part of the process. When I talked to the catchment administrator, I always asked him, well, how did you understand what you wanted to do there? And he says, I just went out and talked to people. And I said, well, can you expand on that a wee bit? He's like, well, no, like, that's all I did. Like, he spent years talking to people in this catchment to try and get an understanding of the whole system, of the drivers and the pressures, the different values that people had for the fresh water, again, to try and broker a solution that was actually going to be enduring and reflect the community values. So what he found out was that tangata whenua wanted to fence the river, but farmers at that time didn't link their land use practices to decline of freshwater quality. Of course, they thought it was about the wastewater treatment plant, right? They're like, well, the wastewater treatment plant is the thing which is now contributing to the pollution. It isn't us. But ultimately, as this engagement and discussions continued on, the farmers began to appreciate that they could do things to help improve freshwater quality here, but that they would need help to do it. They didn't have, you know, the extra $50,000, $100,000 or $200,000 that was needed to do riparian fencing, or that they had the actual, you know, ability to carry out that labour themselves. So that's where the catchment management comes through. Catchment management group came in, applied for funding, got the community involved, and began to actually do those sort of actions with the consent and collaboration of the farmers. Now, the catchment administrator was hired by the Hawke's Bay Regional Council initially, but very early on he began to work independent of them, and how he did that was by effectively applying for a whole bunch of different funds like the MFE, MPI funds to help do the practical work, and taking a wee bit off of that in order to pay for his time working in the catchment. As this person who works for the Hawke's Bay Regional Council said, the fact that Nick works autonomous, that was his name, is the key factor. He spends every weekend and evening there. He has to do report writing for funders, but otherwise he can think solely about the project. That's all. That's his goal, is to work and be a part of the community in the catchment and to try and bring about improvements to freshwater quality. So scientific monitoring of the river began in 2011. This was also complemented by the use of approaches informed by Aotearoa Māori, such as the Cultural Health Index, which was developed by Ngāi Tahu's Gail Tipa. And so what happened here was that this also engaged the tangata whenua. They were involved in doing more, you know, qualitative assessments using the Cultural Health Index of the freshwater health of the river, trying to examine the Māori of the river, while the Hawke's Bay Regional Council were doing the scientific monitoring, you know, of the different attributes that they were interested in. Also really important to the success of the intermediary work in this case study was that he prototyped different things which he didn't necessarily think were going to work in response to the community. So when they were doing the riparian planting, they had to get rid of weeds at the side of the river, and he proposed a one-time use of glyphosate to get rid of the weeds, and then we'd replant over it with some natives. The local community were uncomfortable with the use of glyphosate. So he said, well, okay, I'll trial an alternative. I'll trial an organic herbicide. And what they found was that it was ineffective. But it was through this process of the community actually seeing that this person was listening to their concerns, that they tried something different, and that they saw for themselves that it didn't work, that they were actually willing to go and try, and they did use glyphosate, and it worked, and ultimately they only needed to do the one time. So he could have had the attitude, well, I was right all along, but instead he had the attitude, it was like, well, I'm part of the community wants this, let's try it out, let's see what happens. As I said before, this administrator also applied for multiple funding sources. What's great about this catchment management group, and could be inspirational for those of you that might be looking to start similar things, is that they began to develop their interest beyond freshwater management. So they applied for funds from Predator Free 2050. so they're now engaged in pest control work. They also got funding to construct walkways and shelters along the river, and they also helped build a blue penguin colony. So once the riparian planting started, isn't that they were just sitting on their hands like, well, what do we do next? They thought, well, let's get on to the next thing, and to the next thing, and to the next thing. The catchment plan, that was the original reason it was brought on in 2011, was finally finished in 2016, but it was totally different in form and content than what the Hawke's Bay Regional Council were expecting. Instead of it being like a prescriptive set of rules, it was more like, this is what the community values, these are the actions that they're doing to try and get it in place. So although it might have been initially envisioned that it was going to influence a plan change in Hawke's Bay Regional Council, it was in such a form that it couldn't really inform that. And so as promised, this is an example of voluntary land use practice change where, in this case anyway, fecal contamination levels in the river were measured to have declined by 15% in May 2017, and this was the greatest improvement for any river in the Hawke's Bay during the same period. Now, I'm told by freshwater scientists that that E. coli is an attribute which can flow up and down pretty easily, but it's been a persistent change. And as well, remember when I mentioned that there was a cultural health index that was done by the local tangata whenua? Well, they reported that tuna and eels had returned to the river when they hadn't seen them for generations, and that inanga was starting to also breed in the river, which is something that they just had not seen for a very long time. So it was bringing real benefits. So this second case study is the Aotearoa catchment, which is in a totally different part of the Hawke's Bay. So this was right up in the mountain areas of the Hawke's Bay. Up there in the top left is the Taupo district. So this is a much more colder and harsher environment than the sort of the plains area of the Hawke's Bay. The trigger behind by the establishment of a catchment managed group in this case was a newspaper article called Death of the Waterway. That was published in 2009, so the article stated that urine and dung pouring onto paddocks from 9,000 dairy cows on several nearby farms was leaching through Pama soils into the Aotearoa River, and as a result the Aotearoa River no longer had any fish. It was well known as the lever trout fishery beforehand. In response, the Hawke's Bay Regional Council asked one of their staff members to develop a response. He wanted to pursue a sort of a voluntary collaborative response, but at the time when he talked about it within the council, his colleagues, as you can see here, were quite sceptical. He said to me, at the time there was quite a lot of discussion with people saying, it's a mess, let's just regulate it. I just started and was surprised by some of the discussion, and I had to advocate for a different way of doing things. Some people said, we will let you have a go, and when you fail, we will regulate it. The assumption is that regulation can solve everything. So remember, as I was pointing out earlier in the presentation, I think there's quite a lot of problems with this worldview. Often when you set policy and you set regulation, it's really difficult to implement it. So this individual here was also along a similar line, and what he wanted to do was to pursue a voluntary approach because they knew that effectively the sword of regulation was hanging above these people. So it was nearly like, he didn't give an ultimatum, but it was nearly like an ultimatum for the local community, which was that you can either pursue a voluntary approach in which you're going to have some empowerment and some say over it, or you can let the Hawke's Bay Regional Council come in and regulate it, and who knows what's going to happen. So the Aotearoa Stakeholder Group was established in 2009 in response to the increase in nitrate levels, and basically in response to the fact that it had become a public issue through the newspaper article. Monitoring of the river, which began in 1999 after the establishment of a big dairy farm, enhanced understanding between the links of farming and nitrogen pollution. But like in the first case study, farmers initially didn't link their practices to the high nitrogen levels. This awareness again was achieved through iterative conversations with farmers in the catchment over many years, including very specific events. The catchment administrator here told me that there was a field trip that they had, just going through the catchment, and what happened was that some of the roads they had to use were really muddy and they didn't want to take too many cars through them, so everyone ended up getting into 2 or 3 cars, and so what that did was precipitate all these different conversations between the farmers, the council staff, some of the environmental representatives that were there, and this sort of created social understanding amongst all of these different groups of people as to what the issues were in the
Modelling and scenario work, so like looking at, okay, if we reduce nitrogen fertiliser use by this much, we'll achieve, these levels in the river. We're fused with social science methods to create like a systemic view of the drivers and pressures on the freshwater system. Like I said, modelling devise limits for nitrogen use, and these social science methods sort of develop social understanding about different values of the river. One small one that they did was they invited everyone to bring pictures of the catchment to a catchment group meeting, and initially many people didn't really understand what was going on, but it was when a dock representative sort of showed pictures of them like fishing in the river with their family, having a picnic by the river, that they were able to say, oh, okay, these pictures are themselves an expression of the values that you want to protect through the work of the catchment management group. Also, like in the first case study, they prototyped some different things to see if they were going to work. In this case, it was around the time where Lincoln University were trying to get people to try out the DCD nitrogen inhibitors that they were developing, but unfortunately during this case that was the time when China got really concerned about it, and they had to stop those trials. Also, like in the first case study, they developed a draft strategy. They also envisioned that this would lead to a plan change within the Hawke's Bay Regional Council, but this did not occur. Despite the failure to get a plan change, the practice changes which were promoted by the stakeholder group and by the catchment administrator, such as limiting fertiliser use. Also, another one that was important was that they showed an aerial picture of the catchment to the farmers, and they asked them, where are you currently wintering your cows? And they discovered that there was quite a lot of farmers who hadn't been talking to each other initially, who were wintering cows next to the river simultaneously, and they agreed, well, okay, maybe we'll do a rotation, so it isn't always happening simultaneously. So it was these sort of things that the catchment group were able to encourage without the need for prescriptive regulation coming in, which, as I say, resulted in measurable improvements in water quality. In 2015, it was reported that the nitrate nitrogen levels in the Hurunui River had declined to 3 milligrams per litre after peaking at around 4, and the practice change initiated after 2009 helped explain this reduction. Unfortunately, the catchment administrator, who had been doing a great job of being the intermediary, of bringing all these people together, was forced to go into the tuki planning process, which I'm about to talk about, and the group just sort of naturally dissolved. Now, unfortunately, that voluntary practice change momentum slowed, and now recent monitoring that I got from LAWA is showing that the nitrogen levels are beginning to rise again to the levels that they were before the group came in place. So, moving on to the third case study. This case study is going to be a wee bit different. It's sort of, it describes a very similar process to what happened in the first two, but it also shows that when a competing policy process comes in over the top, it can completely upset the voluntary agreements that happen in the catchment group and basically lead them to think, why do we even bother with this in the first place? So the Hurunui catchment is part of the Tuki catchment, which is in the south of the Hawke's Bay. It was considered a priority catchment for the Hawke's Bay Regional Council because it was contributing a high amount of phosphorus pollution into the Tuki River. So the Hurunui stream isn't a particularly big stream. It isn't really close to any sort of large community, and isn't really valued, say for fishing or for recreation or anything like that. But the Tuki River certainly is. And so the concerns was that the high phosphorus levels in the Hurunui were contributing to algal outbreaks and macrophyte growth in the Tuki River. It was the Plan Change 6 process which sort of started all of this. It was a response to the Hawke's Bay Regional Council to the 2014 NPSFM. And the rationale behind Plan Change 6 was to boost regional prosperity within ecological limits, and the idea here was to construct something that I'm sure many of you have heard about called the Rui Taniwha Water Storage Scheme that was going to store water up in the highlands, and then it would provide flushing flows into the Tuki River to try and get rid of that macrophyte and algal growth, while also, of course, providing farmers with irrigation water which would boost that regional prosperity. So the the idea was that you're going to bring about ecological benefits at the same time as boosting production. Yeah, that's what I said. And also, this is probably getting a bit confusing here, but HBRC during this process shifted their rationale behind managing phosphorus pollution. Initially it was just through soil conservation and reducing sedimentation, but by this time they had begun to be able to identify visually areas of farms where you could see that phosphorus pollution was coming from. So what they started to do was do on-site, on-farm visits where you would see an eroding hillside and they'd say, we need to plant some trees there. And that was going to be their response to try to control the phosphorus levels which were coming out of these eroding soils. Now, because HBRC considered phosphorus to be the dominant limiting nutrient for periphytic growth, they argued that it was more important and that they would get better benefit out of managing phosphorus than they would out of both managing phosphorus and nitrogen simultaneously, because the nitrogen levels would need to be so very low before they would have an effect on the growth of algae and periphyte. Now, I'm not a freshwater chemist, but I do know that there is an ongoing debate as to whether that is true or not, but I'll leave that to them. So selected farmers and Tai Whenua representatives were asked to join the Papanui stakeholder group. So rather than the Whanganui, case that I mentioned earlier where the whole community was around, this is a wee bit more like the cannery processes where you're invited to join. Initially they followed a similar process to the other two. You get the stakeholders involved, you co-develop a strategy, and you say to these people you're going to lead the implementation of the strategy. The theory of change here, the reason why I thought they were going to achieve environmental benefits was that they were going to manage phosphorus in the stream, and they knew that that was a major contributor to the problems in the Tukituki River, and they identified non-regulatory actions such as riparian planting and shading as the best way of achieving this. But, as I said earlier, this hinged on the construction of the Rui Taniwha water storage scheme, when the Environmental Protection Authority, though, were making a decision on whether the scheme should go ahead or not. They looked at HBRC's plan to manage phosphorus, and they said, you can't just manage phosphorus, you need to manage nitrogen and phosphorus at the same time. This was a big news item when it happened at the time. I certainly remember hearing about it and thinking, yeah, they do need to manage both of them at the same time. That makes a whole bunch of sense. But now, having gone through the case study and gone and talked to them, I can understand the rationale of both the council and the stakeholder group in wanting to focus on the non-regulatory actions which limit phosphorus, because that's the thing that they felt like they had control over. That was the thing that they knew they could do something about very immediately. So farmers were initially really enthusiastic about the non-regulatory initiatives, but once the decision was made by the EPA that they also had to regulate the nitrogen use, the voluntary practice change momentum, the riparian planting and the shading basically slowed to a crawl. Plan change 6 did become operative on the 1st of October 2015, but then 2 years later, like I say, after various legal challenges, the Rui Taniwha scheme was confirmed that it would not be built. So the elements that were sort of underpinning all the policy that was being developed sort of ripped apart, because the Rui Taniwha scheme would not be there to provide the flushing flows into the Tukituki River. Unfortunately, this isn't as great a result as in the previous two case studies I was talking about. For the median nitrate levels, they're well above the plan goal there in Plan Change 6, but importantly as well, the phosphorus levels which the farmers were so interested in protecting have continued to stay well above where they were initially planning them to be. So we're nearly getting to the end, but first I want to just sort of bring in some broad case study lessons. What we argue is that ecological improvements can be achieved by communities without the need for new land use regulations. That's what we can see from the Whanawiki case, that's what we can see from the Tahurua case, and that's what might have been possible in that third Papanui case if the EPA had decided to take a different approach. For us, it's these intermediaries who forge the community collaborations and effectively work between governments and communities who are the critical actors that enable this to be able to happen. However, we recognise that despite the presence of an intermediary, in the Papa Nui case, I didn't talk about it much, but there was a similar sort of HBRC actor who was trying to drive the community here. The actions taken did not result in any sort of improvements. One explanation could be that these intermediaries really need autonomy from the councils in order to do their work properly. As I said right at the start, intermediaries are typically understood as people who are neither working for government or working for the communities, but are sort of working for themselves to help implement policy. And this is still something we're working through with the research. We think that this work, what they do, the intermediary work, is completely undervalued at the moment. And maybe what these case studies show is that we need to highlight a new actor, a new sort of role that councils need to fulfill. Maybe they're state-sponsored intermediaries, state-endorsed intermediaries, people that are working both for the council and for the community who are able to forge these solutions and who are able to help people actually enact changes on the ground. Now you might think, well, how on earth, say if we went out and employed a whole bunch of people to fulfill this role, how do they know how to do it? Where do they go in order to be able to learn how to become an intermediary to help achieve these voluntary land use practice changes? Well, I'll go through it very quickly before getting to some of your questions. We've developed something, Manaaki Whenua, we've co-developed it with our Hawke's Bay Regional Council partners. There's a framework called the Land Use Practice Change Framework. And what we think is that this framework takes the lessons from these case studies and turns them into a set of questions which we can be used to encourage land use practice change as well as devising these community-led outcomes. So when I say questions, the framework itself has like a whole bunch of different questions like what would you do in this situation, what would you do in this situation, informed by theory and practice, which provokes whoever's reading it to reflect on an element of land use practice change. Then we offer a whole bunch of tools and methods which could potentially be used in order to help answer these questions. But what we want to say is that we want this to be as agile as possible. It isn't prescriptive, it isn't telling you must do this step by step. It isn't even linear in the sense that we say you must follow this certain path. We recognise that the context in which you're trying to implement freshwater policy or you're trying to achieve practice change in the Hurunui is going to be different from that in Southland, is going to be different from that in Northland, it's going to be different from that in other countries. So we're trying to create something which is as agile as possible. Now, if you're interested in the framework, this is something that perhaps we can talk about after the presentation, but I've got some material that I could email you or I could share you. So just some sort of final conclusions from me before we get to questions. As a sort of an overarching statement, I think we could say that RMA planning is not agile enough to respond to new problems and this raft of new policy directions which are coming from central government simultaneously. Our solution, invert the policy cycle, promote land use practice change prior to or simultaneous to policy development to make sure that you're getting runs on the board, that you're getting gains within the community, you're bringing the community together and they're seeing the tangible things that are actually happening as opposed to simply recreating a planning process over and over and over again. Why? This allows environmental benefits to accrue through establishing voluntary land use practice changes, and it also allows the time for councils and governments to think about the policy so that they can develop something which is robust, well thought out, and is integrated well together so that farmers have, and other land users have very clear directions on what they have to do. As I said, I think the land use practice change framework which was just promoted is something which offers the tools and knowledge that these new intermediary actors need in order to help people achieve this. So these are some contact details for me here. You can follow me on Twitter if you like that sort of thing. I always talk about freshwater issues there. If you want to read our paper on freshwater policy implementation, it isn't freely available on the internet. There's it's locked behind a dual paywall. But please feel free to send me an email, and I'll make sure to send you out a copy of that. If you're interested in the practice change framework, please get in touch with me, and I can send you as much information on that as I possibly can as well. But I'm interested in hearing your questions and learning from you as well. So thank you very much for listening to me.
Thank you, Nick. Thank you. Are there any questions for Nick about that?
Thank you, Nick. That was good to catch up on that. Your examples, I mean, maybe the way you presented it rather than the actual fact, all seem to be rather top-down and not what I consider to be community-led, particularly with the role of the Hawke's Bay Regional Council and this intermediary. Do you think that was possibly a reason that didn't all of them succeed, that there could have been more strength if they'd been bottom-up and more independent?
Yes, that's a fair statement. The first one, the Whakawehi Catchment Management Group, is definitely the best example, and that was purely bottom-up. It was led by the community. In the last two examples, the Aotearoa and the Papanui, the local community, despite them being large catchments, were really small, and they were dominated by the farmers who worked and lived there. And so those processes were admittedly triggered by actions which were taken by the Hawke's Bay Regional Council, but especially in the Aotearoa case study, there was a real ownership of the whole process, which was taken by those farmers and other community stakeholders that were there. You know, it was a sort of level of detail that I couldn't get into here, which yeah, I think illustrate that even with a top-down approach done the right way, you can begin to you know, really engage the community and get them to sort of, you know, think about the implementation challenges and to begin leading implementation solutions.
Yeah, Nick, thank you for your presentation. It's an interesting way of looking at things, but the cynic in me says that when you brought up all your freshwater acts, 2011, 2014, 17 and 20, they all align with the political cycle of elections.
Yep.
So hence, they're only coming out to please the voter base in the urban area,
Yep.
and they usually attack the rural. I think the intermediaries that you speak about, a lot of them, like farm plans, etc., the reason they got into those farm plans, they saw an opportunity to diversify their business and make money. And sometimes I don't think those intermediaries are there for the best intentions.
Yeah. So on your first point, yeah, I agree. It's quite it overlaps perfectly with the electoral cycles. And the 2021, certainly the Labor government came in and promised that they were going to deliver freshwater policy, and the EPSFM was part of that. So that was explicit from them. The previous three iterations of the EPSFM being put through by the national government. In regards to the intermediaries, I understand your concern with the role of those private sector groups. I've been doing a lot of interviews recently as part of a project for MPI where we're looking at the role of advisors and consultants in primary industries. And some of the things that farmers tell me about is that they can get captured by these people, that if they don't have alternative sources to information to go to, they ultimately just have to follow the advice of that person that they're getting, and if they get led down the wrong path, that can lead them to, you know, to lose a lot of money or to lose faith in receiving that sort of advice and information in the future. That's why, and it's still a work in progress, we're trying to work through, is there a way that councils or central government can help fund people to fulfil these intermediary roles in a way where they don't get captured either by, you know, the interests of whatever, you know, council their political directions happens to be, so that they can be fully attuned to what that community wants and wants to deliver out of freshwater management. And that's what we found in that first case study. That was the best thing, was that it was the community were all involved, they were all leading it, they all felt this ownership over it. And once the process that the intermediary had gone through of establishing those relationships with everyone, they were able to get agreements which were really beneficial. So I understand your cynicism. I mean, I'm presenting something that's new, and we're still working through the details of how it might actually work in practice. But yeah.
Someone on the blue road.
Yeah.
My name is Quinn Williams, and I'm heavily involved in the wine industry with all those things you talk about. And I sort of want to make a statement, give you a bit of background as well. That I have been involved in the environmental industry plan for 25 years. And firstly, we did it to ourselves, and we control it, we run it, and we have the people that are passionate about running it and controlling it. And the industry plan transits across catchments, because we have vineyards and industry in all areas. So one of the things I did about 2 months ago was an all-day thing with Hawke's Bay Regional Council on the suitability of our industry program to meet their needs. And they're our trial council. We weren't successful. We were going to have Canterbury as well, but we weren't successful in engaging Canterbury. And so our thrust at the moment is to have a third potential avenue for land producers to belong to the FNP, be in a catchment, or be in an industry plan which satisfies the requirements of the government and the regional council. And I can honestly say, we've been doing this for 25 years. I've been on a project for the last 12 months, upgrading the questions we ask, the objectives we have, and the KPIs that we have to achieve those goals or better. Now, our real fear is that we don't succeed with the regional councils we've got to deal with, and our plan gets destroyed. It will destroy our enthusiasm, it will destroy our initiative, and all that sort of thing. And in some ways, we are our own, not facilitators and initiators of it. We take our own ideas, we go and do our research to implement those up. I will say we're not perfect, I will say we've got problems, but we have 6 pillars that we operate in, and water is one of them. Water, waste, pest and disease, all that sort of thing. So the far-reaching vision of the industry is better to be better than compliance.
Yep.
And we'll do it to ourselves. But we've been doing it to ourselves since 1995. This year we've had a major review of the questions we ask ourselves and how we do things. And that's the project task I've had for the last 12 months. But what I would say, and I've done this at Fawns of Lincoln too, is that I think industries should look at that and do it to themselves, because they will control it. They will find the ways of achieving those objectives without being told how to do it.
Yeah.
And our current problem is we can go so far in water, but we don't really know what the standards are yet to come. So we're writing a placekeeper sort of standards that we work to, but we know that every year we'll review it, everywhere we'll change it, and we audit, we question our members every year. They do a scorecard, and we audit them every 3rd year. And the value of that is that you can make statements that have the evidence, you can promote yourself internationally with the evidence, and you can bring all the visitors here and show them that you want to sell goods and services to, and know that you have the evidence and you do it the right way. We are not perfect, I'll say that from the start. We've got some rogues. We have in excess of 96% of our membership do it voluntarily. So
Can we move on to the
I'm
next
trying to
question?
throw that in as
Someone behind you.
Maybe if I do,
No, stop.
I'll just respond.
Yeah.
I think what you've just illustrated is the challenges of doing this, and even being ahead of the game, when the rules change, they can, as you said, usurp the voluntary momentum that you build through taking responsibility for the issue yourself. And that was exactly what I was describing in that 3rd case study, which was when the farmers bought into the science of managing phosphorus. They brought into we can enact the changes to reverse the trends here, and then it was when a competing policy process came from the outside and said, no, you've actually got to focus on something else. And the thing was is that they were doing the phosphorus stuff was voluntary, whereas the nitrogen regulations, which they then had to do, was compulsory. So all of a sudden they had to go from we're doing riparian shading and riparian planting to we have to use overseers to model what's going on in our farm. And they're like, we weren't looking to do this. So yeah, I really appreciate your comment, and I appreciate the difficulty.
There's a third way. I think there's a third way that can be part of the whole thing, and that's the industry plan.
Yes, and in response to that, I think that probably does have a lot of benefits. Of course, different industries have different scales, and as I mentioned, the local context is often different from the national context. So say wine growers in Marlborough or North Canterbury, they might have a certain set of particular issues which are relevant across those different catchments, but that might be different from what's going on in Otago or Hawke's Bay.
Gisborne wine growers don't do anything about irrigation.
Yeah.
We're into it all the time.
So having an industry-wide plan across different catchments could work, but it also could replicate some of the problems which I've highlighted here, which is that if you come to an agreement and okay, this is what we should do as an industry body nationally, it just might not make sense for a certain farmer in a certain catchment, and then they lose the initiative and they begin talking to their mates, and it all sorts to begin to
I'm quite prepared to battle that at our level.
Yeah.
And deal with those technicalities without. We know that that's the game.
Yeah.
And we know that's the ongoing game anyway.
Well, you sound like an intermediary, which is great. You've said like you've been doing it for 25 years, and you know what I'm saying is that role that you've been doing has been historically underappreciated, and we need to figure out a way, which I haven't figured out yet. I'm interested in hearing from you and from anyone who's got experience in this area as to how we can get people to do that role in an effective way, which isn't necessarily captured by private interests. Yeah.
I like what Mr. Williams was saying, and it reminds me of what Beef and Lamb is doing in the various regions, and also Foundation for Arable Research, because each of them has got a farm environment plan template. But what you're coming at is on the local catchment level, isn't it?
Yes, it is. Yes, it is.
Yes, but I wanted to respond to the gentleman in the front there talking about the quality of advisors and intermediaries as well, because really that must come down to professionalism, and we need to know, who is professional and who isn't, and what institutes they belong, professional associations they belong to, and so forth. Like the Institute for Primary Industry Management, or but a lot of the environmental advisors are other specialists, and they may be hydrologists by training or something like that. But as an overall concept, if you're going to find biases in scientists, there is a body of theory now which is fairly simple, really, which the scientists can be the honest broker, or they can be the issues advocate, or they can be, there's a couple of others as well. And there's a book called The Honest Broker, if anybody wants to follow up on what that's talking about. I find it a useful framework. You would know what I'm talking about.
I do. I think so.
Do you think one of the successes of catchment groups is the scale of the catchment itself, and that you've got like-minded neighbours, perhaps, doing similar things, and all realising that they have to change, and by collectively knowing each other, that the response is a bit more positive? Is that?
I 100% agree with that. I think that is one of the benefits of having that catchment or sub-catchment scale. And one of the issues that's running through my head, though, is that scale, in the Tāhurua or the Papanui, we might be talking about, maybe a max. Well, in the Tāhurua, there was literally like 5 farmers. They had huge land holdings, but there was only 5 of them, and a couple of them were overseas owned, which made sort of engagement difficult. The whangaweki catchment. It was small enough so that the intermediary was able to literally meet everyone and talk to everyone and get an understanding of what they thought and valued of that catchment. But you couldn't do that in Christchurch for those people who I've heard talk about working or contributing to the zonal committees. The catchment or the Christchurch West Melbourne Zone Committee captures 500,000 people probably. There's no way that you can go out and negotiate and balance the interests of 500,000 people. And there's also the issue of the fact that there are nationally important freshwater bodies that are valued by people who live in urban centres but who might only ever travel to them once in their life or a couple of times in their life. And then there's the values and the needs of the people who live in that local region, and those might conflict. And I think that's where, instead of the intermediaries and the catchment groups, that's actually where we need robust democratic political processes to still be going on, so that we can have those open debates about what we value and how we sort of balance those. But yeah, I agree that the scale is very important in this case.
Nick, one thing that I think about is were there examples of coordination between those intermediaries? So if you link them up and got them working to a sort of common goal, if you like.
In this case, they do all know each other.
Right.
But it's more that so there will be goals that are set by policy, and of course, like the communities and the groups have to comply with those overarching policy. But I think the important thing is that they're responsive to the communities as well.
Right.
So remember the examples that I gave of the prototyped actions, in particular the use of glyphosate. That's one where even though the person involved was sceptical about what the community wanted, they listened to them, and the community then subsequently saw that they were being listened to, and that just builds layers of trust and in what is going on, as well as again that sense of ownership as to when they see, wow, there's been a 15% reduction in fecal contamination. They actually have pride in that. They think, wow, our community is doing something special that other parts of New Zealand aren't able to do.
So you gave us 3 examples of, excuse my pessimism, but effectively 2 failed. And each of them started with a shock event, really, and to basically turn people's heads. In Canterbury, our shock events are almost policy related, and the nature of our catchments is sometimes that it's really hard to see the connection between a farm and water quality impact. And so therefore the policy provides a shock event to say, guys, you fellas upstream have got an issue that's causing something downstream.
Yep.
And so how do we get ahead of these shock events and try and turn farmers' heads to try and realise that and you've got to realise that also the farmers are enabled by other policies that regional councils put in place around effluent, etc. So they get a consent to farms with a sweet. They're just doing what they've been told they're allowed to do, and all of a sudden they've got to turn around and go, shivers, you're doing something wrong now. Well, you should have told that from the start. So there's really competing sort of tensions there.
Yeah.
And how do we get ahead of the shock events, I guess, to make sure that we don't get to that point?
So that's a really good question. It's a really fascinating question. So for a wee bit of background, one of the reasons why I mentioned a trigger event at the start of each of the case studies is that in our framework that I mentioned right at the end, that's one of the first elements to understanding the situation, is what's triggered, like, a community concern, let's say. And I think you're probably right in pinpointing that in Canterbury, that those have been policy things. One case that I know about quite well is the groundwater zoning, which happened in the Selwyn district in the 2000s. Now, what happened there was that Environment Canterbury weren't requiring people to measure the amount of water they were abstracting from the aquifers. So they calculated that the aquifers were over-abstracted because they assumed that every farmer was taking their maximum allocation all the time.
So there was, you could say that the trigger there was like a concern about over abstraction. But then that went to a court case, which was the Linton Dairy court case, in which ECAN tried to say you can't abstract fresh water, and then the court went back and said, you've got no clue how much water is being abstracted. Because of the way the RMA works, the farm should be allowed to take it. And so that was a huge shock for ECAN and precipitated a big planning process, which led to the natural resources regional plan. How do we move away from that? It's a really good question. I honestly can't answer that. I think I'm going to have to think about it for a while, because the first thing I think about is do we need to move beyond it? Can we move beyond it? Like, I think there are going to be, whether it's natural disasters, cumulative events that happen, or policy which comes in, which is really difficult to implement. There is going to be shock elements involved. And I guess if I'm thinking about it in terms of outcomes, if a shock event comes, including a policy, and that brings people together and they're able to achieve some of the things that maybe we see in the first case study and in the second case study until that momentum was lost, that it would actually be a good thing.
I think it's effectively, it's in process now, to be honest with you. I mean, just the awareness of the impacts is better, and the policies allowing activities takes, and safeguards that are being put in place takes account of those impacts. So therefore it's going to happen organically to a degree.
Yeah.
But it's often that shock event that turns people's heads, and it's maybe not how we want to play it.
Yeah.
It's the benefit of actually the fact that we're all talking to each other and dealing with this issue, that you're getting a community building up who are more resilient. Whatever shock it is, whether it's a earthquake or a disease.
Yeah, no, that's fair. And I guess the other point I just wanted to mention, which I'm sure a lot of people here know about, but I think the general public struggle to understand, is that there can be really long environmental lag times between these implementations happening and the results actually happening at the end. With the huge issue here in Canterbury, which is nitrogen pollution into groundwater, that's something that that could take hundreds and hundreds of years to solve. And when you talk about politics and you say, oh, this problem is going to take 100 years to solve, like, the public don't like to hear that. They don't like to hear this is this problem was caused over multiple generations, and it's going to take multiple generations to fix it. And really our responsibility isn't to fix it, but to turn it around so that we're heading in the right direction. That's certainly my opinion. But there are certain issues where you can see that there are environmental improvements very fast. So it's such a complex field that I think people often sort of underestimate those sort of elements.
Yeah, I was going to say, I mean, we've reached a point where things are no longer, our land use activity are not sustainable, and they've caused issues. The big issue that's looming and coming is here with us already is climate change. And there's an awareness certainly within Hurunui about the effects of climate change on the water resource, on the ability to farm the way that people have been farming for years, and the impacts of that, and the land use change that's going to be required, and the people change that's going to be required on that. And so dealing with those sort of issues in a smaller catchment-based arrangement means that people are kind of talking to each other and understanding issues without getting too stressed about things, because they're solving it within their own space.
Yeah, indeed. And I'm not quite sure if this is the case in the Hurunui, but I remember a conversation I was having a couple of weeks ago with a farmer in the Hawke's Bay, and I asked them, well, how are you coping with the droughts and things like that? And they said, well, we're in a microclimate. We've actually had more rain this year than regular, so we're all right. Which to me illustrates that this catchment approach is very vital, because the catchment next door might be bone dry and in dire need of assistance. Whereas what this person was saying was, well, right where I am, we're actually sitting pretty good at the moment. Sometimes I leave my house in Green Park, which is just south of Lincoln, to go to Lincoln, and the weather changes do to us before I get there. Again, I don't know if that's the case up here, but yeah, that highlights how, you know, just even the meteorological context can be totally different. And then you've got soils, and you've got all sorts of other drivers, so it's a lot.
Thanks for your presentation. It's been really interesting and thought-provoking, and I think quite useful as well, so thank you very much for that. You talk about doing this work either before or simultaneously with policy development, and I was wondering if you had any feedback from those who do the policy development as to your proposed approach.
No, I haven't gone there yet. Yeah, I haven't. I don't know what our planners would think about this. I imagine they might not think too highly of it. But yeah, I'm coming from an outside perspective. I haven't been involved in planning departments, in regional councils. I haven't worked for a regional council, which I understand is a major sort of gap in practical knowledge that I have. But hopefully, by engaging and working with regional councils like I did with the Hawke's Bay, by interviewing and trying to research and be open with these regional councils, that they can share their knowledge with me, and I can provide maybe a wee bit more of a, not a neutral, but an outsider's perspective, where they might be inside the actual thing and sort of struggle to have that imagination to think of a different way of doing things.
Have you looked at those exemplar catchments?
I know of them. I know that Pelorus is an exemplar catchment up in Nelson, and interestingly enough, MFE are looking at funding a group to help develop a catchment management group there in those exemplar catchments. And the first one's going to start in the Pelorus, and certainly my partners and my colleagues, and myself are very interested in contributing to that work, but I'm sure they'll have a lot of people who are interested in helping.
If there are no more questions, I shall give our traditional cake and wine to Nick and thank him very much for his contribution. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
I would like to apologise for being a very poor host. I'll put it down to being flustered by the Northwest. But we should note that we have our Mayor, CEO, 2 councillors and some ECAN councillors here this evening. So I'm very pleased that you're able to come along. Thank you for coming. Thank everyone else for coming. Our next meeting is on October the 22nd, same place, same time. This time it's Dr. Hamish Rennie, and he's talking about the Resilient Farm Plan tool, which is about dealing with nature's challenges, and it's about dealing with natural challenges that are thrown up to farmers. So that's in a month's time, October 22nd. Hamish Rennie. Thanks very much. Sorry.
Could just let people know if, as they're leaving, if they hear gunshots, there was a pest control shoot going on.
Does that also mean keep away from there?
There are lots of silencers on them.
Okay.
I think they're a rough neighbourhood or something.
Apologies that we're unable to provide refreshments. We're still observing our COVID regulations. Hopefully we'll be free of those soon. But thanks very much for coming. Thank you.